We recorded an episode on writer's block and creative blocks after reading the book, The Midnight Disease. And we were basically creatively blocked the entire time throughout the episode. Some interesting things came from the conversation, don't get us wrong. It was a good one, but there was something a little bit tough about it for all of us. After the episode, we had a conversation about how things went, which I think was very illuminating. One, about how the episode went and why it did, but also about writer's block and creative blocks in general. So we've chosen to put that at the beginning. Enjoy.
So bonus material. This was a really rough episode for me to film somehow.
Yeah, well.
It's interesting that in a discussion that was largely about creativity and creative blocks, we became quite creatively blocked.
Yeah.
What was going on for you during the episode?
I think maybe, I was feeling very pressed for time all week because there was just all the normal stuff I had to do, and I had one day less to do everything. So I was actually finishing the book this morning. I finished the book this morning, and then I spent some time going over it and just learning all the medical terminology, and which I actually used barely any of, but well, that's not true. I did actually. And yeah, I guess just my brain was pretty full, and there wasn't any meditative space to relax or to get into a clear state before the episode. And then it's it gets into a loop, because once you start feeling like it's not going well, it just starts to get worse.
Right.
I think part of it was we spent a bit too much time talking about why we didn't like the book yesterday. I think that probably got us less motivated about it.
It might have. I really didn't enjoy the rest of the book, actually, after we had that conversation. I can't do it anymore.
Yeah.
For the same reasons that we had said that we didn't enjoy it, or for other reasons?
Probably similar reasons. Yeah, I felt like I was really rushed for the last bit, where I was reading the earlier parts at a more leisurely rate, the last two chapters, and also because I was sort of seeing, I was sort of like, oh, maybe this is rambling, and maybe this book does suck. So I guess I just got into the suggestibility of it.
Right.
And also I just wasn't feeling great mentally and emotionally today.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
I don't know.
I got suggested into enjoying the book more and trying to be a little bit less judgy about it. I actually did have a better time with the later chapters than with the early chapters. Because I guess there was some kind of negative preconceived notion after she talked about certain things that was coloring the way that I was reading her. She still didn't become my favorite author, but I was able to enjoy it a lot more.
Yeah, I like the finish especially. It was very poetic. I'm just trying to find the bit.
Yeah, I think I just rushed through the final part. I don't know, I guess also because writing block and all these issues are very personal to me, and so it was hard to talk about it on an episode.
See, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, I was thinking that maybe at some level I was thinking that I should bring my personal experience into it, but I just wasn't feeling like I could.
Do you feel like you could now for a little bit of bonus for these lovely people?
Not really. I don't know that I can, there's much interesting I can say. Yeah, I guess this was a rough episode for me to film. I've definitely experienced a lot of writer's block. I still don't really know what writer's block is. I feel like we were blocked during this whole episode, which is very frustrating and makes writer's block feel very inevitable. It makes creative block feel very inevitable. And I definitely often feel like I'm completely wasting my life by trying to be creative. So,
well, an important thing to remember is a person is so much more than their worst day. So sometimes I think what you're experiencing is very common among creative types, actually. And so I remember my friend Aaron used to tell me, like, oh, when I have a bad day painting, I just think it's going to be like this forever. Like I've lost my spark. The well is dried up. But I do think I like to use this phrase, you're drawing from a well that will never run dry, or you're drawing from a spring that will never run dry, because that part of your creative spirit is permanently connected to the source, and it can't be detached from it. It's just a matter of letting it loose. And that's something I really believe with every fiber of my being, that creativity is innate in us. It just needs to find an expression.
I just feel like every day, like I'm always like working to be like the better person that I'm supposed to be. Well, part of it is like the thing Jim Carrey said, like if you get too well, you won't be able to produce anymore, which is something I'm definitely sometimes have some fear about. But also like sometimes there's days just like I feel really like blocked and like frustrated at everything, and it's like it just feels like it'll always be that way.
Right. But that's not a feeling. That's actually your interpretation of the feeling. So be careful to make the distinction.
You know, I think it depends on goals. Like, I think a lot of creative people and artists want to produce this like tortured, emotional, insightful kind of stuff that goes to like the depths of pain in people's souls that a lot of people consider great, because many of us can relate to it. And maybe, yeah, if you are really mentally healthy, maybe you can't produce this kind of tortured whatever, but that's not the only way to impact people. Like, we don't normally think of somebody like that this way, but somebody like, I don't know, Tony Robbins, or like some of these authors that have based their careers around helping people be better, are also extremely creative and extremely impactful. And I don't think that we should look down on them because they're happy. Maybe it's a little bit of a collective crabs in a bucket syndrome that we have with artists.
Well, they're certainly not producing literature.
Who? Tony Robbins.
Yeah, Tony Robbins and like Tim Ferriss and these guys. Like you can't compare them to like Nietzsche or Dostoevsky.
True.
Well, but
what type of work do you want to
compare
do?
them? I mean, they're different expressions, you know?
Yeah, but I mean, like what you're saying still isn't like disrupting the idea that like you need to be depressed to be a great literary artist.
But what evidence does one have that you need to be depressed to be a great literary artist?
Well, the book brought up some evidence, like the idea that successful writers are 10 to 40% more likely to be manic depressive and 8 to 10% more likely to be unipolar depressive.
Yeah, but that means the rest of them aren't.
It's a minority that aren't.
Mm-hmm.
Hang on, you said 10 to 40% are manic depressive.
10 to 20 times. No, 10 to 20 times compared to the general population.
So it's a minority that aren't, but It's not an impossibility. I mean,
Yeah.
if you were able to do it, then that would be something incredibly unique and therefore great. Right. I don't think that they're inherently mutually exclusive. But I think that a lot of what's going on is that literature tends to play on our feelings of sadness and struggle. And I'm not too into literature, but I'm not familiar with any literature that like draws you into joy. But if someone was able to cultivate a craft that could draw their audience into like genuine joy, I think that would also be incredible.
You can't have one emotion without the other. Like that's part of the message of the book is you can't have joy without sorrow, or you can't have deep joy without deep sorrow.
Well, sort of. I don't know if that's exactly true, but yeah, there's something there.
Yeah, how do we explain unipolar depression?
Well, unipolar depression often still has hypomanic phases.
Okay, well, could we have unipolar mania with hypodepressive phases?
Probably, but I mean, like even like in the way that like novels are structured or the way that like stories are structured, like you can't have every scene be happy.
No, you can't.
No.
Part of this, you have to alternate different emotions in different scenes.
But
Yeah.
I mean, clearly you're dealing with struggle right now. If you overcome it,
well, that's what comedies are. Comedies are when it ends on a happy note, and tragedies are one way of looking at it. Tragedies are when it ends on a sad note. But in both cases, it's just what you leave the person with. Like they're both tragedies and comedies have ups and downs. I mean, Shakespeare probably like A Midsummer Night's Dream or something like that is what you're talking about a little bit, like something to cultivate joy in the audience, something designed, and there probably are modern equivalents too.
Yeah, maybe. Not just laughter, but like deep joy. I mean, I'm just saying there's many. Being a happy artist would probably take an extra level of creativity because there's not so many models for it.
Here's the thing. I think a lot of people don't really know what a truly self-actualized person would look like, and they can't really imagine what that person's relationship to sadness or sorrow would be. And so maybe in our heads we have this figure who's like permanently happy or something like that, or not complete. And that's part of what makes it difficult to imagine somebody who is at once complete and a good writer. But yeah, this idea that you need to hold on to your pain to be a good artist, I don't buy it. It's just not true in my experience.
I don't know. I mean, in my experience, the good artists I have been in a lot of pain, but so have most other people.
Right.
So it may just be part of the human condition that we go through pain, but yeah, I don't know. Certainly some people's is more than others. But I guess what I'm saying is if you can create an image of what you want to be, then I think you can move towards becoming it. But maybe there's something that's blocking us from creating that image.
Yeah, I don't know that it's necessarily the pain that produces great art, but it seems to me it's the emotional range. Like having the emotions be like so uninhibited that they're able to reach very high highs and very low lows. Like having them be like unanchored almost. And it seems like that's in some ways, this is kind of where I don't understand depression, because it seems like depression is almost like a flattening out of emotion for some people, but for other people, it's just like a deep sorrow. So I don't really understand how it fits into depression, I guess.
It seems like, honestly, like a flattening out of emotion over time kind of does produce like some kind of sorrow. I mean, here's an idea for perhaps a metaphor. Like we've talked about a little bit about how in certain cultures, someone who might be considered psychotic or schizophrenic would be mentored to channel those abilities into being a shaman and learn how to like enter into certain states. And perhaps you don't have to be chaotic, like how we would normally think of someone who is bipolar or psychotic or extremely depressed, but someone with those tendencies who wanted to become an artist could learn potentially how to channel that range.
Can you repeat that?
Okay, so this is just an idea. We've talked about how people who might be considered psychotic or schizophrenic in our culture, in other cultures, sometimes will be mentored into learning how to cultivate those abilities and channel them into becoming a shaman or something like that, so they know how to enter those states and lean into them and work with them as they're happening, but it becomes less pathological and more of a source of strength and inspiration. And perhaps that could inform some kind of a model for a healthy expression of a large emotional range for an artist, where instead of trying to blunt your emotional range or make yourself happy, you learn how to lean into your different states and channel them in a way that is still somewhat in control or but meaningful to you. Transforming a pathology into a set of tools.
Yeah, that's interesting. And maybe that could help with writer's block.
I'm sure it will. I'm sure it would.
I think thinking about it in that way would be a good starting point. I'm not really a writer, but I have block with so many things all the time, and I'm not good. I can't say that I've gotten over it. But when I am feeling really blocked and am able to get out of it in the moment, what it usually looks like is some kind of a deep breath and and then breathing out into the work, like with the frustration.
And part of the problem with writer's block is like the emotions start to build on themselves, or like they become like recursive. When you place a lot of importance on something, it's like what Freud said, where if you like eroticize something, like if you eroticize walking, then you won't be able to walk. Like if you place a lot of importance on something, then you start thinking about it, and then the mind starts to produce anxieties. Like there's all these like fearful reasons. Like maybe this is the wrong thing to be doing. Maybe I'm not actually good enough. Like I tried to write and it wasn't good. Maybe I'm not inspired. Maybe I need to take a break from writing. And then they just start to build on top of each other. Probably writing every day is a good idea, no matter how you feel. That definitely improved the quality of my writing. I'm going to turn off the recording.
Okay. I sit down religiously every morning. I sit down for 8 hours every day, and the sitting down is all. In the course of that working day of 8 hours, I write 3 sentences, which I erase before leaving the table in despair. Sometimes it takes all my resolution and power of self-control to refrain from butting my head against the wall. I want to howl and foam at the mouth, but I daren't do it for fear of waking the baby and alarming my wife. After such crises of despair, I doze for hours, still held conscious that there is a story that I am unable to write. The worst is that while I'm thus powerless to produce, my imagination is extremely active. Whole paragraphs, whole pages, whole chapters pass through my mind. Everything is there: descriptions, dialogue, reflection, everything. Everything but the belief, the conviction, the only thing needed to make me put pen to paper. I've thought out a volume a day till I felt sick in my mind and heart and gone to bed, completely done up, without having written a line. The effort I put out should give birth to masterpieces as big as mountains, and it brings forth a ridiculous mouse now and then. That was a quote by Joseph Conrad describing his writer's block.
Most writers have experienced writer's block, but it's still unclear what this condition is. Is writer's block a spiritual blockage, a problem of inspiration, or something more like a psychiatric disorder? In this episode, we'll be discussing different perspectives on creativity, writing, and ways it can all go wrong. To start off, we're going to discuss writer's block, then talk about hypergraphia, its opposite, and then get into what inspired flow state writing might look like and how to get there. We'll be drawing from the book The Midnight Disease by Alice Flaherty and trying to drop practical advice along the way.
Okay, so why don't we start off with I won't say it that way. So let's have a brief discussion of whether we liked the book or not, or what we thought of the book. Did you guys enjoy The Midnight Disease?
I did enjoy it, but the first time I read it, it must have been about 8 years ago. And I got halfway through and I was very turned off, partially by her style. Sometimes I find that she digresses and makes comments which aren't really that related. And also her seeming advocacy for psychiatric treatment for writer's block or pharmaceutical treatment for writer's block, which seems like, at the time, to me, it seemed like something very extreme and not a good way to go about things. But reading it again, I like it. It's got a lot of interesting facts in it about hypergraphia. Like it must be a very uncommon condition. I've never met anybody who has that, is actually compelled to write every day to the extent that they'll write hundreds of pages, maybe of the same thing over and over again. So it's very interesting to hear about those cases and the cases where it actually produced something good.
Yeah, generally if people with hypergraphia weren't writing the same thing over and over. They were writing stuff that felt meaningful to them, whether or not it was good or not.
Yeah, for me, this book was tough at times, somewhat for similar reasons that Kurt described. I had a difficult time connecting with the author on an emotional level or understanding kind of the greater meaning or bigger picture to what she was writing a lot of the time. But as I got further into the book, I think I started to understand her a bit more. I think it'll be an interesting discussion for us when we talk later about some of the neurological components of writer's block and other conditions and how the author suggests maybe pharmaceutical treatment and what we think of that.
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting book. I enjoyed reading it. I thought there was like useful perspectives and advice in there. Yeah.
So can you mention one of the things that would be useful for you, Ariel?
I found her discussion of writer's block useful. I think she talked about a lot of different perspectives and possible ways of looking at writer's block, and I just found it useful to hear that articulated.
Yeah. So I remember you said yesterday that sometimes when you have writer's block, you might be fixed in a certain way of looking at it, and having that variety of perspectives can help. Cool.
Cool.
Is there anything else you want to say about the book, or?
Well, I guess I'll say this. At times I felt like for a book on creativity and talking a lot about emotions and inspiration and things about the limbic system, it felt often a little bit dry or disconnected. Like I felt a lot more connected with the quotes that she pulled from authors speaking about their own writer's block than I did with any of her descriptions. Sometimes it felt a bit clinical in nature, the way that she described different people's behavior. And that was a bit off-putting for me.
I mean, was it the way she was describing it or the fact that she was applying a clinical lens to these issues at all?
It's hard for me to say exactly why I liked a book or why I didn't like a book, because it's kind of like trying to get at why you like a song or why you don't like a song. But I think it was the way that she was describing it. It felt like she wasn't. I understand that she's an author, she's a writer, so she was intimately connected with these issues, but it felt like it was from kind of a distanced perspective. I didn't. She brought up a lot of interesting points, but they were all kind of at a surface level to me. And where I felt depth was when she quoted other people.
Okay. Well, what do you think depth is when it comes to art and creativity? Like, what is the deep perspective on writer's block and writing?
I think one superficial part of it, which comes into play in this, is like sometimes it seems like she gets into a topic which is something that's very emotional, a personal experience, but she just lets it play out for a couple of paragraphs, and then that's it. Which that sort of thing maybe could take up an entire chapter or half a chapter talking about the depth of her experience.
Okay.
Yeah, that was a great deal of it. As far as the question, what is depth and what is creativity? I think a lot of what makes art and creativity creative is that it is kind of ineffable. I feel like a lot of times what artists and authors are getting at and are great at, and what draws me to them, is that they're able to express something, a feeling or a state or something that people understand, but it is very, very difficult to articulate, or maybe can't be articulated, which is why you often have to use metaphor or narrative or visual or auditory stimulus to invoke that kind of a feeling. So that in and of itself makes creativity and depth very hard to describe.
Okay. So this is kind of getting into our first question. So what is an artist's perspective on writing / writer's block versus a scientific one?
It's a difficult question to answer. But I think one aspect of it, like in this book, she does have this approach, like, let's look at the problem. So when you're very focused on problems, it can be difficult to see the solution, which is probably another criticism of the book. So it's like focusing so much on the problem, you can become much more trapped in it. And looking for solutions, that's when you can actually get free. And being a scientist, you might be compelled to look at facts a lot of the time, and facts aren't very creative. Facts are things about the past, whereas creativity is something about the future, something which has not yet happened.
I mean, I would argue that to understand something, you have to look at both what it's like when it works well and what it's like when it goes wrong. I think there's insight to be found in both. Probably the medical or the clinical approach tends to more look at what goes wrong.
Yeah, I did like in this book how she used kind of these extreme examples of like people with mental illness, and then also people with conditions like hypergraphia, to kind of, well, looking at the extreme of when certain trends can go out of control or beyond what's considered normal in the brain, in order to kind of understand what the base level mechanisms are. As to your original question, what makes an artist perspective versus a scientist perspective on writer's block or on creativity, I don't think that they have to be mutually exclusive. For her, for the author, and from the scientific perspective that she was coming from, she was looking a lot at neurotransmitters and regions of the brain that are active in things like writing, whereas someone who is in the moment might be describing something more like what Joseph Conrad stated, the experience or the feeling itself. I'm having trouble latching onto this question.
Okay.
What do you think about that question, Ariel? What?
Well, I was just going to respond to what you said, Katie. I mean, it's interesting because there's definitely areas of science that focus more on subjective experience. Like we diagnose like these disorders like depression and anxiety according to subjective feeling, not according to brain scans. And certainly treatments like psychotherapy focus a lot on the subjective contents of the patient's mind, which is a process that's a lot more like writing a book than conducting an experiment, probably. So probably the line between the two can be blurred.
Yeah, the line between the two can definitely be blurred. Maybe this is something, and this isn't all scientists or all clinicians, but I know certainly with my experience dealing with therapists, mental health professionals, and also the way that this book reads to me, it seems that often there's a cold distance from the human element or individual element when you're talking even about emotional conditions like depression. Like sometimes it feels like people coming from a medical standpoint or a clinical standpoint are looking for a pattern of symptoms or a pattern of behaviors that meets some certain label. And then there's a specific treatment that you apply. But when you're talking about somebody's depression, what that really is their individual struggle and deep emotional state, and abstracting away to the level of patterns and labeling something as a condition. Not that that's always bad, but I think that it can lead to some distancing from what's actually going on a human level.
I mean, I feel like you're being a bit dismissive of like the medical approach. I mean, like, of course it does abstract away from individual experience to some extent, but like that's necessary in order for these things to be treated in any kind of systematic way. It's just a different domain. Like if you're writing a novel about your experience, then talking about it in like a clinical abstract way isn't going to be very interesting probably. But if you're looking to treat these things medically, then looking for patterns between people is pretty necessary. Like I don't think there needs to be a value judgment between one and the other.
Yeah, but I think it can go too far. It was kind of strange where she describes, I think she's in a mental institution, she's being admitted, and one of the staff is asking her a few questions, and she's making these nuanced distinctions between metaphors and delusions. Like she's describing, looking at her own hands and describing them as being like leather claws, and she's kind of precise, and the staff member ends up just writing on her sheet psychotic, and that's it. So that's the kind of pigeonholing or the kind of broad strokes you can get when you think too much in terms of categories and you don't let those go for a minute in order to be human with the person.
I mean, certainly it's possible to go too far in that direction, but and I mean, for one thing, you have to look at patterns. Like that's just like a basic fact of language. Like every single word we use is like identifying a pattern. Like you can say like it's like everything that you're saying about these like I don't know the tyranny of abstraction. Like you can say that about like the word anger. Like the word anger doesn't acknowledge my individual personalistic experience of anger that's different from your experience of anger, but it's still useful to have a word like anger. Same thing with depression.
That's fine, but that's why there actually some people are advocating for the move away from terms like depression and psychosis and talk about things more like specific symptoms. Because when you have these broad terms, you find that a lot of them there's a lot of comorbidity, and that's because the terms aren't very clearly defined. So you have a person who's at once is manic depressive and has anxiety disorder, several disorders at once. Actually, what he really has is a bunch of symptoms, and that's at a level that it can be categorized more precisely.
But you could say the same thing about the symptoms, though, as you do it. If they do the symptom thing, then in 50 years they could have the same problem with the symptoms. And if symptoms are often comorbid, then it does make sense to group them together as a syndrome, in my opinion.
Yes.
I'm not opposed to there being labels for syndromes. That's not exactly what I was trying to get at. It's just that this approach to labeling syndromes and treating them as if they're hard categories or really well-defined structures lends itself to certain fallacies and certain flaws. And I think it lends itself to often there's a level of dehumanization that comes in the system with this approach. Here's an interesting data point about psychosis specifically that might be interesting to this discussion. In developed countries like the US and Europe, where they take a very psychiatric approach to psychosis, the recovery rate for people diagnosed with schizophrenia is about 1/3. And in developing countries where people tend to not be treated at all, the recovery rate is about 2/3.
Yes, I'll note that the recovery rate is even higher when they use methods like open dialogue, which is popular in Scandinavia.
I mean, I would argue, though, that I'm not arguing that there aren't problems with the Western medical system. I'm arguing that the idea that categorization is the problem, that's what I'm kind of resisting. I think it's a kind of a low resolution way of looking at it.
Oh, I think the categorization is a low resolution way of looking at it. So like you said, the symptoms are, when you get to the level of the symptoms, you can say, well, the symptoms aren't a perfect description either. And I'd say, yes, that's right, because the symptoms need to be improved and you need to look at the more nuance. And you also need to look at it sometimes from a human perspective and relate to people and hear what they're actually saying, as they do in the open dialogue method.
But again, though, I don't think categorization is the problem. Like if you identify categorization as the problem, you have to throw away all of language.
Hang on, but am I saying that categorization is the problem? I'm not sure if that's what I'm saying.
Well, what are you saying?
I'm saying that broad sweeping categories are a problem and they need to be improved and they need to be made more nuanced and look at a level of fine detail instead of just grouping a bunch of categories without looking at how they can be improved.
Okay, well, how do you define an appropriate level of abstraction or nuance for a category?
Well, it's a process. So now I'd say we have enough knowledge that the categories are like manic depressive, depression, and psychosis are too broad because we have enough information to get a more finely detailed model.
I mean, by this logic, though, we don't actually know that Katie's statistic that she just quoted is in any way accurate, because we don't know that the phenomenon being labeled psychosis in first world countries is the same as the phenomenon being labeled psychosis in third world countries.
That is a possibility.
Yeah, that's possible. But it's more likely, like with that, the information we have about the open dialogue method in Scandinavia and other parts of Western Europe, I think we do know that those statistics are pretty reliable.
From my perspective, I don't want to say that categorization is the problem. I think that categorization lends itself to this cold, inhuman kind of distanced perspective, which I see as the problem. But categorization isn't the problem. Maybe I can give an example from personal experience with the mental health system. When I was a teenager, I was depressed. I mean, I was diagnosed with depression when I was very young, but there was a point when I was a teenager where I went to a psychiatrist for potential medication for anti-depressants. And the way that I was treated, and this aligns with many other people that I know, was the psychiatrist had a clipboard and he very coldly, matter-of-factly asked me, in the past 10 days, have you felt on average unhappy, neutral, happy? And he had me circle some smiley face charts. Then he says, have you experienced any suicidal thoughts lately? And I said no. And he was like, okay, good. And then moved on straight to the next question. And that kind of experience, can you imagine if I had experienced suicidal thoughts lately?
Yeah. I don't see how you'd even be comfortable saying that in that scenario, in that context. Because it sounds like he hadn't really gone out of his way to build rapport or anything like that.
No. And this is a little bit far away from, I don't know what the author Alice Flaherty is like as a clinician, and not all clinicians are like this, but it seems to be a common experience. And I think that our paradigm where we treat psychological and emotional issues like other medical issues lends itself to this kind of treatment. It's not something that I can point out as a problem. It's a disposition that I perceive. It's an attitude.
But I mean, again, I can kind of see how you could still have a category of something like depression or even a finer subcategory and view it as a medical issue without having those problems that you guys are bringing up.
Yes, probably, but the two are definitely related somehow, because if you're looking at things in this analytical way rather than looking at it in a personal way, then you can make mistakes like that in the process and in the individual treatment. So like when I was working in customer service, that was one thing they emphasized, like, don't just process your customers. Your customers aren't forms to be typed into a machine. They're real people. And that's how people should be treated in good customer service. And if you slide into that model where you start thinking, all right, another customer is calling, what's this, what's the problem that they have? And then you try to slot their problem into a box, and chances are you're not really listening to them. And that means you're going to make a mistake about the problem, and you're going to lead down the wrong path with the solution. That's what tends to happen.
Well, I mean, that is something that tends to happen, but arguably it shouldn't happen in the medical system, regardless of whether it's a mental or a physical issue. I mean, I don't really think it's okay if someone comes into the doctor because they have some kind of physical ailment and the doctor is just blasé with them and doesn't take the time to understand their individual symptoms and slots them into an inappropriate category. Like, that seems equally bad to me.
Yes.
And I don't really necessarily see that mental issues and physical issues are all that categorically different. It seems to me that they feed into each other to a very large extent.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Often they do feed into each other. Oftentimes mental issues have physical causes or physical components. It's not totally different. However, it is. I would say that if we're going to make a category, any categories, I would say that it's fair to say that those are categorically different. Because
can you repeat the whole thing? You guys keep like fuzzing out a bit. I don't know if it's just me, but can you repeat everything you just said, Katie?
Okay. So you're right. It's not a hard line. Definitely physical issues often lead to mental health issues, and they are interrelated in many ways. However, I think that if we're going to make any categories, it's fair to make a category between mental health issues and physical health issues. They present very differently, and also I think that poor bedside manner in a purely physical issue, like for example, if I fracture my arm and my doctor isn't very nice to me, it might have some impact on how my arm heals, but it'll probably be pretty minor compared to if I go to a psychologist because I'm hearing voices and the psychologist is mean to me, that's everything.
I'm still not totally sure what the point is that you're making, because I feel like there already is a distinction between mental and physical health issues.
You said that you didn't think that they were categorically different, and I was saying that if we're going to have any categories at all, which you're arguing for, I think that's a fair category to have.
Yeah, obviously I think they're categorically different, but I said that I think it's appropriate to still group both of them under the category of medical issues. And within that category, they're distinguished. I don't know, do you disagree with that, or are we just having a syntactic thing?
I think that some mental health issues are medical issues and others are not.
Or which ones do you think are and are not?
For example, if I am experiencing depression because I have a B12 deficiency, that's a medical issue. If I have slipped into a depression because of mourning the loss of my father, I don't think that's a medical issue. I don't think it's appropriate to treat it as a medical issue.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But it's all like, it all depends on like what's considered a medical issue or not is like a social phenomenon. Like, it's not like there's like an objective category of what a medical issue is. Like, it all depends on what both the individual and society choose to treat that way in their lives.
Well, here's maybe a more objective question that we can ask. Do we think that there are certain issues that are inappropriate to try to treat with medication?
Well, I don't really like that question in some ways, because I feel like for one thing, I guess we can answer that question, but I do want to clarify that, like, I don't necessarily think that every medical issue, or the definition of a medical issue, is things that should be treated by medication. Like, you talk about like the difference between, let's say you were experiencing like a grief from the death of a relative or your father, and you were having a really hard time pulling yourself out of it, and a lot of time went by. Like, it might be appropriate for maybe in the future, when this is more common practice, it might be appropriate for a clinician to do like psychedelic assisted psychotherapy or something like that, or to prescribe like a micro dose of mushrooms to help you gain insight on the issue and to like reintegrate mentally. And that's a way that I could see like a medical approach to the problem being appropriate and helpful.
So I can see it being appropriate and helpful to have a psychedelic experience to try to integrate something like that. And perhaps in the future, a clinician, a doctor or a nurse might be able to administer something like that. But the main problem that I have is the disposition of our current medical field and medical providers. Why are certain people licensed? I don't think that somebody who is going to be an aid in a psychedelic experience or in a therapeutic experience without any kinds of substances should... The qualifications for these people right now, it's about passing certain tests and going through a certain form of education, and it has very little to do with the softer, more emotional elements that I think are actually what makes those types of quote unquote treatments work or not work. And I would be very hesitant to have doctors administer something like psychedelic treatment. There are some doctors who would probably be good at it, but I think that maybe the average doctor would be actually worse at it than the average yoga teacher, to be honest.
Well, I would very much disagree with that statement. I guess my problem with this conversation is I kind of feel like you guys are like correctly pointing out problems with like the current medical system, but then applying it to the practice of medicine generally, or the practice of like medicalized mental health generally, which I think, and I guess what bothers me about it is because I feel like that betrays like in certain ways like a lack of optimism and imagination about where medical mental health could go, but also it's pretty dismissive of the hundreds of millions of people who are currently being helped by medicalized mental health.
I don't know. I don't think I'm saying to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff. And yeah, what you're saying is right. There's a lot of good stuff that comes out of modern medicine.
I understand why you're frustrated with that. It's hard to articulate exactly what my issue is because maybe doctors and clinicians could be part of a more holistic solution like I'm thinking of, but I'm looking at it as a movement, and the way that the movement of Western medicine has gone. And I just don't see the institutions that are set up in Western medicine leading to like really good mental health treatment. Perhaps I am being overly dismissive. I personally don't. I know multiple people who have experiences with mental health care in the US and not many that have good experiences. So maybe that's why I'm kind of dismissive. I'm probably a bit biased. I mean, I am biased.
I mean, what do you mean by mental health care in the US? Do you mean like psychiatry specifically? Like, do you mean people who are going into Jungian psychotherapy and it's not helping them? Do you mean people who are doing DBT or CBT? Like what are you like?
What's DBT?
Okay, so cognitive behavioral therapy is a form of therapy where you try to change your thoughts and your actions and your feelings in a holistic way. And DBT is CBT integrated with Eastern religion, like Buddhism. And it's become mainstream in Western medicine. That's the thing. I feel like sometimes, I guess another frustration I have is I feel like sometimes people talk about like Western mental health care and stuff like that, and they're only thinking about psychiatry, which is, there's a lot of problems with psychiatry and a lot of controversies with psychiatry, but it's not the only thing that's going on. And more as time goes on, like Western medicine is integrating like Eastern practices and meditation and like even psychedelic practices and entheogens to a certain degree. So I feel like it's just kind of unfair and a little bit outdated to look at it that way. Maybe I'm strawmanning you, Katie. I don't mean to do that.
I should probably look into this more. I don't know how common those practices are. I do know that about 1 in 6 Americans are on a psychiatric drug like at any given time. So I don't think that many people are in any kind of therapy at any given time. So I think that psychiatry makes up, I should look into it, but I think it makes up like a huge prong of the American mental health care system. And I'm also talking about how when you go to your primary care physician, which is what a lot of people, like the only contact that a lot of people have with the medical industry, and you tell them that you're suffering with mental health care problems. I mean, I've had experiences where my just regular medical doctor, I told them that I was depressed and asked if I could be referred to someone. And they were just like, how about I just give you Zoloft? And I think that's a lot of people's experience. For people who are getting into CBT and DBT, that's great. And I probably shouldn't have categorized it all, but what I'm criticizing is maybe the common attitude of doctors towards mental health and many people's experience with it.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of factors that are going on here. So part of it is about the culture, which is like about a quick fix. So people have this kind of mental magic pill mentality, like I'm just going to take a pill and it's going to make me better, like taking an aspirin or something like that. And that can be common between the medical professionals and also the patients. And then there's also other factors that go into it, like sometimes people are time poor or they're money poor. They don't have time to go into a lot of therapy, which would actually help them in the long term. Or say in Australia, I hear it's quite common for someone to go into a psychiatric appointment, and the psychiatrist will just ask a few questions. It's about a 15-minute appointment, and they'll say, okay, so you want to increase the dose, decrease the dose, or something like that, and then the appointment is pretty much over. So there's problems. Also, another problem is sometimes people are just desperate and they feel like they've exhausted the opportunities of the medical system or the psychiatric system. They haven't got support. They haven't got these new forms or these more modern forms of therapy like CBT, and they feel like they're at the end of their tether, so they take the pills.
I mean, there's a lot of complicated stuff here. Like, there's a lot of problems with the pills, but the pills do help a lot of people too. So it's complicated.
Yes, that's right.
It's complicated. And I mean, also, I would also argue that one way of looking at it, like that 1 in 6 Americans being on psychiatric medication statistic, is like, oh, these psychiatrists have taken over everywhere and are prescribing all kinds of unnecessary pills. But another way of looking at it is that there's something in the culture that's leading people to these problems, and the pills are a Band-Aid solution. But that, you know, getting rid of the pills isn't going to solve the problem. What's going to solve the problem is to get into the roots of why people are seeking the pills to begin with.
Yes. Yeah, I agree.
Anyway, we had kind of gotten off topic.
Yeah, so the original question was, do we think that that conditions like writer's block, what do we think about the use of psychiatric drugs to treat writer's block?
I don't recommend it. So someone once told me that when they went to the psychiatrist said, okay, well, psychotropic drugs are the sledgehammer of psychiatry. So do you really want to take them? And my friend said, yes. But for writer's block, I don't think a person should be using a sledgehammer. There are many other methods that people can use. So we discussed a lot in Pro by Keith Johnson, and the techniques and attitudes that are espoused in that book are very useful for overcoming writer's block.
There are different types of writer's block, different causes of writer's block, and different degrees of writer's block. Like, some people deal with such extreme procrastination, kind of like what Joseph Conrad described, although I wouldn't say that was procrastination, but some people deal with really extreme issues where they'll sit down for 8-10 hours a day, every day, with thoughts in their mind that they can't get out, and then they end up wasting time, and it severely impacts the rest of their life. But in that case, I don't think that writer's block is an independent issue. It's part of a spiral that someone's in, and maybe something that could be described as writer's block could get extreme enough that psychiatric drugs could be helpful. I don't want to completely dismiss it out of hand, but in most cases, I agree with Kurt.
What do you think, Ariel?
Yeah, I agree with what you guys said pretty much. What do we think about like some of these other newer like psychiatric neurological interventions? Like, they now have deep brain stimulation where they put an electrode deep into the brain, and that it's currently being used as a treatment for Parkinson's disease, and it might be used as a treatment for depression in the future. And there's also transcranial magnetic stimulation where they basically, they don't have to put anything inside your brain, they just send magnetic waves into your brain, and that can have a similar effect. It can change mood, it can unlock creativity, and it's supposed to have no side effects.
I'd have to look into it more, especially TMS, or the transcranial things that you can put on seem really promising. And like you said, I haven't heard a lot of write-ups about extreme side effects like you see with most psychotropic drugs, for example. So I'm optimistic about those kinds of treatments. I personally would probably be willing to try them, but I don't know that much about them. And I wonder if that is revealing some kind of a bias on my part. as to why I'm so open to these types of things.
So the deep brain stimulation, at the moment, you actually have to get a piece of your skull removed in order to insert the electrode. So I don't think that's going to become a popular treatment anytime soon.
Yeah, but the TMS, you don't need to do that.
It's kind of wild to think about something like some magnetic stimulation with some electrodes on the outside of your head being able to change your personality or jumpstart you out of depression. I would be open to it. It doesn't feel like something that would have horrible lasting impacts on the brain potentially, although maybe it would. I think I should look into it more. But my hunch is that I would be open to it. What do you think about it? About TMS?
I don't know, I'd be interested in trying it, I guess. They say like when they point it, there's a part of the brain that's highly associated with writing and the motivation to write. It's the temporal lobe. When they point to the temporal lobe, people typically they either start writing hypergraphically or they have religious experiences or extreme creativity and stuff like that, which is pretty interesting.
So how much does one of these devices cost?
A few $100s. Probably more to get like a clinical grade.
There's something called Halo Neuroscience, which is developed for sports. I don't know how specific you can get about which areas of the brain that you target. Basically, it looks like a set of headphones, and then with the band across the top, there's a bunch of electrodes that go over here. They have a product called the Halo Sport, which last time I looked, I think it was around $300. And basically it's designed to stimulate the brain in such a way that it helps you remember things better if you're practicing guitar or something athletic. But this product it looks like it's only designed to target the part of the brain that controls movement. So I don't know about products that are targeted towards the temporal lobes, if there's anything like that around. I guess maybe you could turn your Halo Sport on its side, look up a diagram of your brain and check it out, but maybe that's a bit risky.
The clinical grade ones are like a wand, so you can point it towards like a specific spot.
Sounds like it could be really dangerous, but you could get a more basic one and just fire it up.
It wears off, so I don't think there's anything too bad you can do. So maybe,
okay.
I guess, if you point it at your brainstem or at your heart, but we don't do that.
Okay. All right.
I would do it. I would try it. I've thought about getting a Halo Sport many times.
What do you guys think about the use of psychedelics to treat writer's block?
Yeah, probably microdoses, not enough that it becomes habit forming. I think that people have to be careful with that. But taking it, once every week or once every month or something, that's probably going to get you in a more creative mood.
I think it would probably be beneficial. Like Kurt said, psychedelics would help get you in a more creative mood. And it is something where the effects basically wear off with some changes to the brain. You end up making a lot of neural connections, but you're not on something where you're totally altering your brain chemistry every day. I think it could be good.
I mean, I sort of feel that way too, but aren't we just biased then? We're basically saying that these one sets of treatments with their possible side effects are fine, and this other set of treatments with their possible side effects are bad.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that as I say it.
I think one big question is about the frequency. So normally if you put on psychotropic drugs, you're told that you take them once or several times a day. And with the microdose of psychedelics, you don't have to take it every day or even every week. to have the positive benefits of it. And it doesn't have to be habit forming if you're careful with it. Whereas with these psychotropic drugs, if you try to get off them after taking them every day, then you're going to have severe withdrawal symptoms.
So I do think it's showing a bit of a bias there. However, on the other hand, well, different psychotropic drugs work differently, but usually it's increasing the flow of a particular neurotransmitter or blocking something or blocking a particular neurotransmitter being taken back up into the brain in the long term. So it's like altering the chemistry of how much of certain things are moving around in your brain, as opposed to when you take a psychedelic, it's usually how they work is it's putting something in that is similar in shape to a neurotransmitter is how I understand it. So it binds to those receptors in a temporary way and basically gives you an altered experience while you're taking it for a temporary period of time, and then it leaves the system and you go back to your normal neurotransmitters. So I think that's probably why there are fewer side effects, perhaps. Well, I don't know if I would say there are fewer side effects, but different kinds of side effects.
In terms of like the neurotransmitter action, there's no real way to make a categorical difference between psychedelics and antidepressants. Like some of them operate on the exact same mechanisms. Like there's both psychedelics and antidepressants that are MAOIs, for example. But it is true that with most psychedelics, you wouldn't take them every day. I don't know, like what about like smoking pot every day? Like, do you guys think it would be as bad to smoke pot every day to like pull yourself out of writer's block or spark creativity as opposed to taking an antidepressant?
I'd say they're probably equally as bad.
It's hard to gauge. Like if you're smoking pot every day, the side effects I would be worried about would be lethargy and slowness and short-term memory issues and overeating. With antidepressants, I'd be more nervous about in the beginning. With SSRIs, you can feel very out of whack. It can decrease your sex drive. It can cause an uptick in suicide. So I'm not sure exactly why. And then the withdrawal from it can again push people into quite severe mental states. I don't know. I'd say both are bad, probably bad, but personally I would be less worried about somebody who is smoking pot than somebody on a new antidepressant if they weren't being monitored.
There's a really good quote by David Foster Wallace where he said, I've been on, well, it's actually not a quote, it's from one of his books, but he said, I've been on antidepressants for about a year now, and I suppose I feel as if I'm pretty qualified to tell what they're like. They're fine, really, but they're fine in the same way that, say, living on another planet that was warm and comfortable and had food and fresh water would be fine. It would be fine, but it wouldn't be good old Earth.
Yeah, I remember a friend of mine told us that like, he'd been on antidepressants for a few months, and he said to us, yeah, stuff still sucks, but you just don't care about it. And I was like, that doesn't sound like a great way to live.
I mean, to be fair to the case for antidepressants, so David Foster Wallace, who's one of the greatest writers of the past 30 years, wrote all his books on antidepressants. He was on Nardil, which is this old style antidepressant that people aren't usually on long term because it causes these like gastrointestinal problems and low blood pressure and stuff. But he was on it for 2 decades. And in the 2000s, he was struggling with a book with writer's block, and he thought that going off the antidepressants could help. So he went off the Nardil, and he fell into this like extreme deep depression that was completely untreatable. He tried going back on the Nardil and it didn't help. He tried other antidepressants, it didn't help, and he ended up killing himself at the age of 46. So that's maybe a case where when we look at that case, it seems like a strong argument for the psychiatric approach.
Yeah, perhaps, but it's an individual case. It's so hard to say if there are confounding factors. So one thing is the withdrawal symptoms from the drug, and there also could have been other factors in his life. It's really hard to say.
Yeah, but you can say that about that kind of argument. You can apply to literally anything. Like you can look at cases where antidepressants seem to be harmful, and I could say the same thing. I could be like, well, there's other factors, there's compounding factors. Who knows? Like you can say
Yeah,
that about
that's
any,
right. I
say that
mean,
about any anecdotal case, right? Like,
yeah, that's right. And that's why normally when we talk about drugs, we talk about clinical studies.
yeah. But I'm just saying, like, looking at individual cases, looking at anecdotes and individual cases has power in a way. For one thing, there haven't been clinical studies on the effects of antidepressants on writer's block or on the effect of antidepressants on writing, so we don't have that evidence. And for another thing, there is something powerful about individual cases, because that's when you do get into, like we're talking about before, like the texture and nuance of an individual life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you have like a particular perspective, like antidepressants are bad, it's easy to interpret the entire world through that framework. Or if you have a particular perspective, like antidepressants are good. Like, I think it's important to be careful not to just interpret even cases that where antidepressants seem to be good as well, like to dismiss them out of hand, right?
Sure. All I'm saying is we don't know the exact factors that went into that. And we can't know. So we have to be careful about the limits of our knowledge.
Well, he wrote Infinite Jest on Nardil, and that we know.
Yeah.
And then he went off Nardil and he died. So that's a case where it seems like, you know, we can say, well, maybe he would have written an even better book if it hadn't been for the drugs. But like, I don't know. I just feel like that's just sort of.
Well, okay. So in his particular case, we know that he was on antidepressants for a long time. And when he went off it, he was destabilized. Is that because the antidepressants were helping him? Or is it because, like we know for sure, going off antidepressants is a really wild ride? Going off antidepressants is like, stuff happens to a lot of people. Like wild stuff happens to a lot of people when they go off of antidepressants. That is way more severe than they ever experienced before they went on.
I guess I just feel like for me, like I've always been like very skeptical of antidepressants. But when I read about that case, my reaction was like, okay, it can definitely be interpreted as a strong argument for the psychiatric case. And I feel like in a way, it strikes me as sort of intellectually dishonest to look at this case and be like, well, the drugs are still the problem.
Yeah.
No, I don't think we're saying the drugs are the problem, just that we don't know. It's hard to say if that's really a case in favor of them. But, you know, I'm willing to admit that in a lot of cases, people are helped by these psychiatric drugs. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, antidepressants must help some people, right? Or there must be something that indicates that they're helpful to a high enough percentage of people. Otherwise, they would have never been approved, right? I don't know if they're always necessarily bad. Well, no, I don't think they're always necessarily bad. It's just, it's kind of playing with fire and blunt objects to the brain. I'm less concerned about antidepressants than I am about antipsychotics and mood stabilizers. Actually, have you ever known anyone who's had bipolar disorder and been put on a mood stabilizer, or known anyone who's been put on an antipsychotic? The reason why I bring it up is because, well, they're prescribed to people who have very extreme mood swings or who have very extreme experiences to the point of psychosis. And I think psychosis and creativity are highly linked. And it seems like the way that these drugs work, anecdotally, it seems like they blunt emotions and blunt the creative process so that it doesn't get out of hand, which is probably good as an emergency measure for some people, but it seems to lead to a lot of negative effects.
Come to think of it, a close friend of mine did take antipsychotics, but it was very short term. It was like just for a few weeks. And his psychiatrist thought that it would help him get through a tough period. I do also know a case. A friend of mine used to be a writer when she was young. She write a lot, and people really enjoyed her writing. Later, she had some problems with depression, and she took anti-depressants and mood stabilizers. And she told me after that she just didn't feel like writing. And I was like, gee, someone put me on a pill, and it's stopped my creative urge. I would be like, no, I would find, I would start looking for any other way. But of course, I don't know what it was like in her situation. Some other things that I think are important to mention, hacks for trying to be more creative, which are a bit more subtle perhaps. So in Tony Robbins' Awaken the Giant Within, he talks about a lot of things about people's posture. So a lot of the time when people write, they kind of hunched over the desk, and that's not a very good open way. Like your lungs are going to be constricted. You're going to get less oxygen, and it's not going to help you. And some people even advocate sitting down and putting one foot forward as if you're about to start running. So you feel a bit of the energy of movement, so you can write with more force. I recommend that book, Awaken the Giant Within. And there's also lucid dreaming. So that's something we've been looking into lately, and it's a powerful way to get in contact with your own creativity.
Yeah, Hemingway wrote Standing Up. It seems like there's a spectrum in human experience where extreme emotionality is connected to creativity. And with some people, this can become overactive. And with some people, it can be, with many people, it's underactive, and many people aren't creative. And it seems that the psychiatric industry is biased towards moving people in the less emotional, less chaotic, less creative direction, because then you can still live a normal life. Whereas it seems like we're probably biased towards moving people in the more creative, more chaotic, more emotional direction, which is why we're all okay with psychedelics, even though their major side effect is risk of psychosis, and why we're less okay with psychiatric drugs, which is opposite the mainstream perspective.
That sounds about right. I think that hit the nail on the head in terms of my own bias.
So one interesting question is both us and the psychiatric community seem to be okay with these like exogenous solutions, like taking a pill or taking magic mushrooms or meditating or using TMS as these ways to treat writer's block and these creative blocks. But how does this kind of approach compare to an approach that was more endogenous, like something like getting to the root of the problem through self-examination or learning to overcome the problem on your own without help from the outside? And what way are we calling for hacks instead of naturalistic solutions?
Well, it's kind of funny because sometimes the hacks really are the naturalistic solutions. Like if you have a habit of bad posture and that affects your attitude, then that really is the root problem in a sense, though it might express itself in other ways. So I'd say that the distinction isn't always clear. But if somebody wants to go to therapy to treat their creative block, I'd say, yeah, why not?
So maybe two categories that we could create to put things in is, on the one hand, there are solutions to problems that are about creating better foundations or tools to deal with the problem. And I would put things like psychiatric medications or like meditation, or even having a psychedelic experience where your mind was open, or a practice of meditation so that you're more in tune with what's going on in your mind and body, kind of in that category where you're bolstering up, or ideally you're trying to bolster up your brain in general to be able to handle all situations so that you can get through this one situation better. But maybe there's other times where you really just have some kind of a block about writing that comes from some kind of a narrative. Like maybe you're overly perfectionistic, and every time you put down words on paper, you are overly critical, and that stops you from being able to write. And if that's the case, then probably these external solutions won't help. And you need to address something internally there.
It's a curious question, because if the problems really are internal and you can't even bring yourself to write about them, it's very difficult to analyze and try to get to the root of the problem.
Well, I think sometimes it's a lot easier to talk than it is to write. Writing feels very final, very permanent, whereas talking doesn't necessarily feel that way. Okay, that's pointing to a myth that maybe I've constructed about writing, where when I'm writing something, I have a much higher standard for anything I put on paper than anything that would come out of my mouth.
Right. Well, I always like to be careful with the notebooks I buy, because if I have a notebook which looks really nice, then I'll be like, oh, don't want to damage the pages. But if I have a notebook that doesn't look very nice at all, I'm like, oh, well, I don't really feel inspired to write in that thing. So you have to find the right balance, something that you're willing to mark.
Right. Well, and that kind of an issue, if you're not willing to mark this notebook because it looks too nice and you're afraid of messing it up, that's something that would probably be better dealt with by analyzing that belief than by doing anything else.
I don't know. I find it's right as long as I can find the right notebook.
Sure.
It's fine.
Sure. But for some people, there may not be a right notebook.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, the standards are too strict for their notebook and for their writing, and where they will put their writing.
What do you think, Ariel, about this notion of external causes as opposed to internal beliefs being the drive for behavior? Well, I don't know if I would say external causes, but things like brain states and being the drivers for behavior as opposed to belief systems being the drivers for behavior. Do you think that we're too focused on brain states?
I don't know, I think I just need a minute, guys. Sorry.
Okay.
How's it going, Ariel?
Okay.
Are you all right?
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about how it's going or what's going on before we continue? Or
No, I'm just having trouble with this episode somehow. And I feel like it's not going well and it's my fault.
Oh well, just relax. It's no pressure. Have a good time.
yeah, I've been in that position before, like with the Nazi cults episode, and it's very difficult. But if it doesn't work out the best, it's okay, and I think we can still edit it into something interesting, and it always turns out pretty good. And it's not just happens sometimes. I don't think it's anybody's fault.
I feel like I'm being excessively confrontational.
I don't mind the confrontation. If anything, I feel like you're not being very talkative, but I think the confrontation is good.
Should we do?
I'd love to hear more from
go
you.
back
I
and
guess.
do some improv games again. You want to take a break or something? We could come back in 20 minutes.
No.
Get some fresh air. No.
I told Kurt a story that I was hesitant to tell on this episode, but was really relevant. And I don't know if I should tell it because we kind of have a lot of material on the topic about antidepressants, but I think it might be good. What do you think, Kurt? Do you think that would be worthwhile to have in the episode?
Yeah. So
Well, I'll just tell it and we can decide if we want to put it in or not.
Sure.
And then we can go on. So in this discussion, I thought I was kind of hesitant to bring it up because it's hard to bring it up. And I definitely have kind of an anti-SSRI stance based on what I've read and what I've learned over the years about how they work and how they tend to impact people. But one thing I've been thinking about recently is I was actually on SSRI antidepressants for many years as a child, like starting at age 9. And I was on them very consistently till I was 14 or so. And then in high school, I would kind of go on and off because I doubted if I should be on them. And when I was that young, I wasn't in touch enough with myself to be able to detect patterns and how they were making me feel or how they weren't. So I really couldn't, I had no idea how they were impacting me. That was part of why I didn't like taking them. But when I look back now, kind of at the trajectory of my life, I know that while I was on them, I was very academically focused. I was doing pretty well socially. I had really no trouble completing work. And when I was on them sporadically, I was much more chaotic. I failed some classes. I had a lot of issues socially. It was a much more emotional, tumultuous time in my life. And then since I've been completely off them, which is all of adulthood, I've still dealt with a lot of issues of procrastination and difficulty with motivation, like severe difficulty with motivation and bouts of depression. And it's only very recently, and I'm talking very recently, that I thought about my life and those meta trends in relation to when I was on the SSRIs and when I wasn't. And it makes me wonder if they were beneficial. Like I could potentially be a case for them being beneficial, even though I have a strong bias against them.
It almost seems like it's about what kind of life you want to lead.
Mm-hmm. That's true. I definitely wouldn't have described myself as creative at that time. Well, creative maybe, but not very artistically creative or emotionally in touch, but much more productive for sure. But again, I don't know. There were other life factors going on at those times, like external factors that could have been impacting it a great deal. And I really don't know how they were affecting my mood. I have no idea.
You mean that you don't know your own emotional reactions to those events? Is that what you're saying?
No, I mean, I know my emotional reactions to those events, but I mean, I really don't know my emotional reactions to the medication. I when I was younger, I could not feel like what my baseline emotional state was and compare it over the course of months. I had no sense of that.
Right. So you don't know which factor was the ultimate cause of the emotions you were experiencing at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, antidepressants are complicated. Like they definitely do seem to make a lot of people more functional, but I guess a big part of my bias against antidepressants is like, I sort of believe that I can tell when people are on them by looking into their eyes. And I feel like there's like a look in their eyes that's like creeps me out. Like it's like there's like a flatness that's like bulging out. Like there's something behind it that's trying to escape.
That sounds creepy.
Yeah, and it's like, and I see it like a similar thing on people who are on antipsychotics, but it's more extreme.
What do you mean by this flatness?
Like there's a look in their eyes that's like almost like their eyes are drawn in crayon or in 2D. But it's a flatness that's like bulging out.
I don't disbelieve this because I also feel like there's some kind of a numbness or a flatness that I see when people are on psychiatric medications. But have you tested it in any kind of way?
Not really. It's just based on observation. It would be interesting to test. I mean, I guess the thing to do would be to ask more people if they're not on antidepressants when I meet them, but it's kind of a personal question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when I was a teenager, I was on Wellbutrin for 2 weeks, but it's not really a typical antidepressant because it's like a stimulating one. And I was on Seroquel, which was a tranquilizer. It's an antipsychotic. So I was on Seroquel for 1 day and I didn't like it. So I stopped. But it felt like being stoned, like on cannabis, but with all the joy and sparkly parts and creativity gone. Like I would just like lie on the couch, like joylessly eating snacks.
Wow.
So I didn't see the point.
I did not feel the antidepressants at all. I remember that was my big thing. But again, I was 9 years old. So I don't think I could feel the subtlety of how they were affecting me day to day. I kind of lied about it and said that I felt better, but I really had no idea.
It seems really weird to give a child antidepressants. So what were the factors that went into that?
Well, there were... It was after a major transition in my family life. I became more socially withdrawn and I was very upset all the time. And I was definitely down. I know that multiple teachers had expressed that they were concerned about my well-being. I was always kind of I don't know how much of a difference there was between my behavior in my early childhood and later childhood, though, because that was something that was kind of always noted about me, is I was very quiet, socially anxious, very pensive. I was very dissociative, but both before and after this family transition, I would spend hours in my room staring at patterns on the ceiling and thinking, or be so in my mind while I was walking around that I would bump into objects, like large objects like parked cars and things like that, and just trip and fall over all the time, things like that. And this was after about 6 months of therapy that it was suggested that I try this. There's also a lot of family history of depression. So yeah, I think it's a little bit strange too, but I also can see why. But yeah, I do think 9 is pretty young to be on antidepressants. It was Zoloft and SSRI. Part of my problem with this experience too is I was taught, or I feel that I was taught a narrative that I had a chemical imbalance in my brain and it was just a condition. I was born that way. This is the pill that fixes it. You'll be on this for the rest of your life.
There was no subtlety about telling you that hypothesis. They presented it as a fact.
Yes.
I mean, although if they want to get the placebo effect working, that probably is the thing to do.
Maybe.
Well, if you give a treatment, you generally want to say this treatment's going to work.
Yeah, for sure. I wasn't ashamed of it, or I believed it wholeheartedly. I just thought, oh, okay. I thought of it like something like being diabetic or something like that. Like diabetics need insulin. I need an antidepressant because I don't have enough serotonin. That's what I thought.
It's a pretty intense experience.
So we're about 2 hours in. Are we still going to stick to the...
Yeah, I was just going to move to the next thing.
Yeah.
Writer's block isn't the only writing-based affliction. Another, hypergraphia, seems to be its exact opposite. So hypergraphia is the compulsive need to write and write and write. The sufferers produce reams of text, often in flowery fonts and filling up every inch of the page. Hypergraphic writing is syntactically complete and meaningful to the writer. In other words, it isn't just repeated words or gibberish, but it doesn't have to be high-quality writing. Hypergraphia is associated with abnormalities of the temporal lobe and is a common symptom of temporal lobe epilepsy. It's one of the pillars of Gershwin syndrome, a personality complex often seen in temporal lobe epileptics. The other pillars are hyperreligiosity, altered sexuality, heightened emotions, and extreme overtalkativeness. Many temporal lobe epileptics become mystics, but others become successful writers like Dostoevsky. Hypergraphia is also linked to manic depression, in particular the manic phase, which is also linked to temporal lobe changes. Manic depression is so common among writers it's become almost a cliche, with writers being 10 to 40 times more likely than the general population to have manic depression. Or what's interesting about hypergraphia is by looking at it, we can maybe get some insight about what it's like. So what do we think about hypergraphia? Like, this was a big part of the book, and like, what do we find interesting about this?
It's just really unusual to think about, like, imagining somebody who just can't put down a pen and just struggling to get out of everything inside of the head. I think that it's, in a sense, that's a romantic idea. Like, people have that idea about writers. A lot of people say stuff like, you're not a writer unless you write every day, or you're not a writer unless you're compelled to write every day. So this is like an extreme version of that. It's hard to even imagine what that would be like.
I found this idea of the temporal lobe seizures to be really interesting and also a bit disturbing, like thinking about certain types of personalities that we consider really artistic or spiritual or, you know, creative and driven to write. And some of our greatest communicators, like Dostoevsky, and another example brought up in the book was Vincent van Gogh, both suffered from, or maybe we could say didn't suffer from, temporal lobe seizures. And yeah, that the fact that those seizures can have such an impact on personality in so many facets definitely lends to thinking about the personality in more of a medical way.
Yeah, it's interesting because this model implies like a cyclic almost rhythm to creativity, because like the seizure sufferers they'll have seizures, and then during the seizures they'll often be like some insight or some, like they'll realize something, or maybe they won't. But it's between the seizures, it's in the inter-seizure period where they have hypergraphia and they do a lot of writing. And similar to people who have manic depression, they tend to write during the manic phase, and during the depression phase, they often get inspiration or material, but they rarely are writing prolifically.
So I think we should talk a little bit about these seizures too and what they're like, because my idea of a seizure is convulsions, physical convulsions, but the types of seizure that the author was describing were often more along the lines of a mystical experience caused by some firing in the brain.
Yeah, I mean, what a seizure is basically large areas of synchronous activity in the brain. And there's different kinds of seizures depending on, and they're classified differently depending on whether the person loses consciousness, which part of the brain they're focused on, or if they exist on both lobes or just one lobe. But a seizure is basically, you can think of it like an electrical storm in the brain. And the idea of synchronization is important too, because like what synchronization means is like, so your brain is this electrical machine, and as these electrical signals travel through your brain, they produce these waves depending on how they're traveling and like to what. So the waves are like, there's like 3 different attributes to the waves. There's the amplitude of the wave, which is how big each wave is. There's the frequency of the waves, which is how much waves there are. And there's the phase shift, which is where the 0 point of each wave is, or like whether they're aligned or not. And basically when the waves traveling through a certain part of the brain are identical, it's called synchronous. And when they're not identical, it's asynchronous, or like different parts of the brain can be synchronous and asynchronous relative to each other. And so a seizure is a large region of synchronous electrical activity over a large portion of the brain, an abnormally large portion of the brain.
So how much would be an abnormally large portion, like 10%, 20%?
Well, a portion that produces a seizure.
Okay.
One kind of seizure is called like grand mal or tonic-clonic seizures. And like the tonic is like basically like the limbs all stiffen out and then they start to vibrate. And that's like the clonic portion. And then there's also like, there's some seizures that are just tonic and there's some seizures that are just clonic. And there's some seizures that affect like a much smaller part of the brain. And those ones can have like all kinds of different effects depending on what they're influencing. Because for something to be a tonic or tonic-clonic seizure, it has to affect the motor cortex. But you can have different stuff happen. And like that's generally seizures that affect a larger portion. Okay, seizures that affect a larger portion, so that's grand mal or petit mal seizures, cause loss in consciousness. And seizures that affect only a smaller part of the brain may or may not cause a loss in consciousness. I think a lot of these temporal lobe seizures are probably also having motor effects as well. But the idea is that, so seizures that are affecting the motor area are causing these like abnormal motor effects that are, like as Katie said, stereotypical to seizures. And seizures that are affecting the temporal lobe more, or that are affecting both, tend to produce these like transcendent, mystical, spiritual experiences, or else these like moments of great insight or creativity. Like Dostoevsky would describe it like as he was having a seizure, he would feel like he was getting like closer and closer to something, like closer and closer to some grand source or incredible insight. And then he would have to stop, he would always have to stop short of it. And so that's what happens when a seizure influences the temporal lobe.
Yeah, with Dostoevsky, does that mean that he never actually received an insight through these seizures?
No, I think he did receive a lot of insights through them, but probably, I think he did describe it. That's just one quote, but I think there was a sense that like the further he went, the more painful it was, but the more he would see, kind of thing.
Oh.
So this kind of has me thinking a lot of times when we're thinking about shamans or trance states or states that people get themselves into when they're supposedly receiving spiritual insight. From the outside, it looks a lot like a seizure. Like a lot of times people will kind of close their eyes and start shaking and receiving the spirit or what have you. And maybe they're quote unquote faking it or just letting themselves go. But I'm thinking about how flashing images a lot of times can induce seizures and things like that. And a lot of times the way that people get themselves into these traits, these states is through things like chanting and repetitive behavior. Do you think does it seem plausible scientifically that a lot of mystics are inducing temporal lobe seizures in themselves?
Probably, yeah. But for them to be able to do that, they probably would already have had to be predisposed to it. Mm-hmm. Or probably have experienced temporal lobe seizures on their own first. But I mean, you said like supposedly spiritual. But even if we could establish conclusively that these temporal lobe seizures, or that these experiences as mystics are having are temporal lobe seizures, that wouldn't discredit the hypothesis that it is a genuine spiritual experience. We don't know what it actually is. Like it could just be like a malfunctioning of the brain that produces a mystical experience, or it could be that mystical experiences are just an illusion our brain produces, but it could also be that the temporal lobe and these temporal lobe seizures are allowing people to perceive something. It could be a sensory thing. So it could be like, or our brain has areas associated with like time and movement, but that doesn't mean that those things are real or don't exist outside of us. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. Just because something's induced by a seizure doesn't mean it's not spiritual. But I don't know how our author would have seen it or how, like, normally these seizures are seen as something that needs to be treated.
Well, I think she was being pretty open to the idea that they were also a big part of what allows for creative inspiration. in some of these sufferers or some of these temporal lobe epileptics.
So how did the seizures relate to other experiences like déjà vu and jamais vu?
They can produce this experience, often in the post-seizure state, experiences of déjà vu or jamais vu or that kind of thing. I mean, one way of looking at it is like, this wasn't in the book, but John Vervaeke links asynchronous brain activity to experiences of insight. So when areas of the brain that were previously synchronized become unsynchronized, that could lead to insight or jamais vu or like new ways of looking at things that weren't possible before. And so one way I'm not sure this has ever been studied, but one thing that comes to mind for me is like maybe if these seizures are causing these massive synchronous activity, maybe it's like jangling loose certain parts of the brain that were synchronized before and allowing them to operate asynchronistically, which could produce some jamais vu or a freshness of perspective, which is often useful for creativity and writing.
There are also some parallels that Flaherty went into about temporal lobe seizures and manic depressive disorder. Could you go into that a little bit?
Hypergraphia is most strongly associated with both temporal lobe epilepsy and manic depression. And in both cases where during the phase where the hypergraphia appears, so in the case of temporal lobe epilepsy, in the time between seizures, and in the case of manic depression, in the manic phase, the part of the brain is highly activated is the temporal lobe, which suggests an association between the temporal lobe and the drive or desire to write, to produce creatively, because this applies to other forms of creative expression as well. And also another parallel between the two is that in both cases, there's like a period of like not writing, which is in the case of the epileptics, the seizures, in the case of the manic depressions, often the depression, but that phase can be an inspiring phase where the writer gets some kind of new material to write about during the hypergraphia phase.
During the seizure phase or the depressive phase, right?
No, the writer writes during
I see.
the or the interseizure phase. And it's worth noting that like none of these syndromes necessarily mean that someone's going to be a good writer. Like Dostoevsky and the many manic depressive famous writers notwithstanding, part of what this research suggests is that talent is more strongly associated with the frontal lobes, the prefrontal lobes, whereas motivation is more the temporal lobes. So like a lot of temporal lobe epileptics or manic depressives will write a lot, but they will not be very good at it. They're just strongly motivated to write. And then you see a lot of the opposite case, which is talented, very talented writers who have writer's block. So that would imply some kind of problem with the temporal lobe, whereas the frontal lobe is intact. Not intact, but the proficient.
So it's kind of funny because you'd think generally if somebody practices something a lot, that they're going to get good at it. So that it's like maybe they don't have the capacity to actually improve beyond, or they just have this very basic skill of writing a lot, but they don't have the analysis to back it up or the taste or something like that.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's necessarily the case that practice alone produces improved performance, because like some people are just really lacking in talent. It kind of depends on your attitude towards what you're doing too. Like, I mean, one example is like we all type for many hours every day, or at least I do, a lot of us do, but we're not super fast touch typers because we're probably not practicing in such a way that's geared towards improving our performance, right? So we're probably not timing ourselves and tracking our performance and getting feedback from others and looking up strategies and being open to new ways of doing things, which is all necessary to have practice be helpful or to produce improvement.
Yes, it's a bit of a misunderstanding that just practicing makes people better at things. Well, practicing makes you better at exactly what you're doing. So if you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, which is just maybe a stream of consciousness spew of writing, that's not going to make your writing more engaging. But if you're intentionally practicing cultivating the skill of writing, then you will get better at it over time if you're practicing writing and then analyzing it and then thinking about your writing and thinking about how you might change it in the future. It's very different.
So it is like if somebody has hypergraphia, it's almost like they're writing unconsciously. It's just like a habit that, like an itch that they just can't scratch, and unable to maybe unable to apply consciousness to it at all, unable to be aware of really what they're doing or have a greater vision of it.
Well, they can. Like writers like Flaubert and Dostoevsky demonstrate that they can. Like there are definitely some writers with temporal lobe damage who fit kind of what you're describing, Kurt. Like people with Wernicke's aphasia are able to like speak very fluently and are often like compulsive speakers, but they don't make much sense. So in some ways, with some kinds of temporal lobe damage, that would be accurate, but it's not so much that their ability to write is damaged. It's that they have just a very highly strong motivation to write a lot. And if they're also talented, then they can use that to produce great stuff. And it could be an advantage. But if they're not talented, it's, the practice might help, but it's not going to, it doesn't have any correlation to talent. It's just about motivation.
Yeah, similar to how everybody talks every day, but some people are much more interesting than others. And I don't think it really correlates to how much they talk.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the third kind of writing, which is inspired flow state creative writing, the kind of writing we all want to be able to produce, or at least many of us. So Kurt, I think you have a quote to read us.
Yeah, so this is a quote from the movie The Hustler with Paul Newman as Fast Eddie, and he's a pool hustler. And in this scene, he's describing the feeling of being really in the moment. He says, when I'm really going, I feel like a jockey must feel when he's sitting on his horse. He's got all that speed and all that power underneath him. He's coming into the stretch, the pressure's on him, and he knows. He just feels when to let it go and how much, because he's got everything working for him. Timing, touch, it's a great feeling. Boy, it's a great feeling when you're right and you know you're right. Like all of a sudden I got oil in my arm. Pool cue's part of me, It's a pool cue. It's got nerves in it. It's a piece of wood. It's got nerves in it. You can feel the roll of those balls. You don't have to look. You just know. You make shots that nobody's ever made before. And you play that game the way nobody's ever played it before.
Yeah. Yeah. So that quote gets into something interesting about flow state, or when you really feel in the zone, about how your tools can almost be like an extension of yourself. There's no distinction between yourself and what you're writing, and you can see it all happening out in front of you.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Walter Tevis, this was written, to put it into a little context, this was written before, Haley, what's the guy's name? The flow guy? Before Mahaley started studying flow, and before recent science about how when you hold a tool, it does actually become mentally, it becomes part of you. So Walter Tevis had some insight from being a pool hustler into what that real experience of flow is like.
What was that?
I tried turning on the fan again, but it's just too loud.
Oh, okay. It sounded friendly.
Kind of is. Yeah, flow state.
Do you guys feel like you have to be in a flow state in order to produce good art?
No, but it helps. And normally I think it gets deeper and deeper. So if you start to write or start to do some creative activity, then after maybe a couple of pages, then you start to get into flow and something interesting will start coming out. It isn't always great when you're in flow, the stuff that you produce, but with time you can see, and it tends to be better. Like you tend to strike upon something. And then when you get into the practice of writing every day, it seems like you get into that state easier and easier. So after a month, you can get into something that's much more profound and much more interesting, relatable, universal, and lovely.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I surprise myself and produce good stuff even when I'm not in the flow state, but usually not. Usually I feel like it's necessary. And like Kurt said, it's like sometimes when you start writing, you're not in the flow state and you can get into it. And if you write every day, then it's like at least you're maintaining a baseline level of skill so that when you are in the flow state, you can take advantage of it. Maybe it comes more often. But
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you think that there's any kind of a relationship between the temporal lobe seizures and the flow state, like the kind of synchronization that happens in the brain?
flow state is likely not purely synchronization. It's like I said before, like insight. John Vervaeke associates insight with like a combination of synchronous and asynchronous phenomenon. So like you could almost think of like a highly synchronized brain as one that's just doing all kinds of stuff that it already knows how to do. And a completely asynchronous brain is one that's just chaotic. But you want some kind of combination. Like you want some synchronous. It's like the synchronous, it's like when your brain synchronizes about things, that's what allows you to perceive things as you've always perceived them. And so when certain synchronous patterns break down, you're able to perceive things in new ways. And that's what produces a lot of the insights that feed into the flow state.
I've read that experienced meditators can somehow be in several brainwave states at once. So normal people will just be in alpha, beta, theta waves. But when someone has been practicing meditation for many years, somehow they have this superimposition of waveforms in their brainwaves. Do you know anything about that, Ariel?
I mean, that's basically what I'm talking about with asynchronous brainwaves. Like alpha, beta, theta is just categories of different wavelengths or frequencies, but frequency and wavelengths are two ways of saying the same thing. So it would just mean, I'm not sure if it's normal to be in more than one at once. I think that probably is something that does happen to people normally, but it would just mean having asynchronous brainwaves with a greater level of variety. It changes your pattern of electrical activity in the brain.
Sometimes when I'm writing songs, I think about this Paul Simon interview that I read many years ago, where he described some of his creative process. And this is something that a lot of people talk about, like carrying a notepad around with you. And sometimes he'll see a phrase or some phrase will pop into his head and he's like, that is a winning phrase. And it might be something really simple, but like say, his songs like 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, something like that. There's something a little catchy about that phrase. And then when he gets to sit down at his writing desk or whatever it is, he'll start constructing the entire song backwards around that phrase. So think, how can this phrase be a punchline in the song or in the chorus? So every verse naturally leads towards that line. But it's not like these phrases are coming from a flow state. Or I guess maybe they could be, but it's like a relaxed state where he's not even thinking about writing songs and something just pops in.
That sounds kind of like the moment of inspiration that a lot of people talk about that just kind of pops out of nowhere and you have something really good.
Did you guys ever experience that?
Yeah, well, the other day I wrote this song, or I wrote a draft of the song, and I was going to the bakery, and I thought, oh, I'm going to buy an alfajor, which is like this cookie that's typical this part of South America, and I thought you go and order and say un alfajor, por favor. I was like, that's a nice rhyming phrase. And I imagined this scenario where a guy walks into a bakery every day and he has a crush on the baker's daughter or whatever, and he secretly wants to ask her out, but all he ever manages to do is ask her for a cookie. So I wrote a song about that.
Yeah, it's cool. I feel like that's a big part of like what improv and a lot of these improv techniques are about, is just being able to like trust your moment of insight, being able to like hear when you're having moments of insight instead of just like ignoring them or editing them out or rejecting them.
Yeah. Something that I kind of regret that's a pattern in my life is like a few times a year I'll be really grasped by some kind of an idea and like inspiration and insight and really thinking about how something can work. And it'll get me on this momentum of excitement, but I usually let it go and don't let it immediately seep into drive towards writing something down or towards working towards the thing. And I find that a lot of times when I let that feeling of inspiration go, I can talk myself out of it later.
Yeah, they say also that your brain, if you don't act on your ideas, your brain starts giving you less ideas.
Yeah, you might call that the law of use, like use it or lose it.
That makes sense. In my experience, the moments of inspiration have come either in a flow state or some kind of a state where I'm very zoned out, which is maybe somewhat similar to what you were describing when you were walking down the street, when you're kind of up in the clouds.
Like, what do we think talent is? What do we think the role of talent is in art?
I guess I don't really think a lot about talent, because if talent is the way people perceive it, like either you have it or you don't, it's not really worth thinking about a lot, because I can never change what God has gave me, and what other people have is their lot. So I have no control over it. So I don't really spend a lot of time thinking about it.
I mean, it can guide your choice of what to focus on.
Yeah, that's true.
I think talent is about, our nature and nurture all causes us to develop in unique ways, unique thought processes, unique skills. Maybe you had a kid who just ran home every day from school for whatever reason, and so they got good at running. I think that talent is a lot about just things that were unconsciously developed that then later we realize can easily be transmuted into really useful skills, or they give us a natural segue into a useful skill, so we can skip a lot of practice that other people might have to do. And also I do think that some people have more capacity to learn certain things than others. And maybe that's because of the way that their pathways have been set up. They just have a much more efficient route of practicing certain types of skills or getting better at certain types of things. So I think that plays into talent also.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's mindset research which shows that like when you're training kids or even adults, focusing on talent is generally counterproductive to doing well, even if it's a talented kid. So like if you tell a kid that they're really smart, then they'll start performing worse because they'll take fewer risks to maintain that identity of being smart. Whereas if you reward kids for effort, then they'll generally perform better. And it's true for adults as well. So it suggests that it's useful to think more in terms of effort than in terms of talent. But at the same time, that's not actually an argument that talent doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's not a talent. That's not an argument that talent doesn't exist. But I mean, if talent does exist, then talent is not the thing that you want to focus on if you're trying to improve, because talent isn't something that is improved. It's something that you find and recognize and you have. It's like your baseline or your potential for something. But even if you have talent, you're only going to improve out of actively working to improve.
Yeah, like it seems like talent is useful in deciding what to do. Like it does seem like there's a real risk in putting a large time investment into an area where you don't have the talent to achieve your goals, and which could also cause you to neglect an area where you do have a lot of talent. Especially since a lot of creative pursuits, especially when it comes to like material success, are very all or nothing. Like for a lot of artists, like, you know, if you're in like the top 1%, you might be really successful. If you're in the top 10%, you might be moderately successful. And if you're anyone else, you probably won't be successful at all. So like you could, I think that's the risk of creative pursuits, is you could spend a lot of time trying to achieve creative success, and there's always that fear, like, is this a futile goal? When in reality, if you pursue like a more like traditional occupation where maybe you have a moderate amount of, like, let's say you have a moderate amount of talent in art and you have a moderate amount of talent being an accountant or something, you may never be a great artist and you could waste a lot of time trying to become a great artist. Or you could just try to become an accountant and still have a decently good life. But maybe that's my own hang up of being worried about not being talented enough.
Well, I think that talent also isn't necessarily fixed, or like what we think of as talent isn't necessarily fixed. Like I think there's two ways of improving at something, or the ways that you can improve at a skill can be categorized in two ways. One way is kind of linear, where you're practicing and you're getting better. Another way is if you are able to achieve some kind of insight, which compounds all of your practice to be more useful in the future. And I think that maybe talent is the foundations of those kinds of things that people have built up naturally, or however they manage to build them up. And I don't know that it's impossible to gain those kinds of insights. It just might need to come from areas other than what we typically think of as practice.
Like what?
Like, I don't know, like mystical experiences, or like, I think if you observe artists who are great, and rather than trying to imitate their work or get better at producing a specific type of work, but try to cultivate the mindset of creativity and divergent thinking, that could be something that could help. But it's a lot less straightforward knowing how to do that.
One part of the book talks about how some people think that the process of overcoming writer's block is to misunderstand an artist that you really look up to, or to like rebel against them in some way. And it's almost analogous to like becoming an adult by rebelling against a parent.
I think that's certainly one way.
It reminds me of that book, and it reminds me of that part in Way of the Superior Man, where he says to really become a man, you must imagine your father dead. You must ignore what your father expected from you, and that kind of thing, to create yourself.
It's a little like that. I mean, many artists also go through a period of, they call it creative illness, which connects back to the manic depressive thing. But many, many, many successful artists like went through a period of depression and even physical sickness and mystical despair almost before they were able to produce creatively.
I think that one important thing a lot of people don't seem to know about or think about is having multiple disciplines. So it relates to what Katie was talking about. I remember in my own life where I became a door-to-door salesman. And then later I went back to rapping. I went back and did battles in my hometown. And I was a much better MC because I developed confidence in this other area and helped me be confident on stage. And you never know exactly how other elements are going to play into what might be your primary skill. Another example would be, say, with Steve Jobs. He wasn't sure what he was going to do at one stage of his life, and he got into, I think it was a calligraphy course or something similar. And later he applied those lessons in the typography on the Macintosh. And because of that, the user experience was much increased.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I don't think that you're completely wrong, though, about having some predispositions towards being good at certain things. And if you show no indications of being a good athlete and you really want to become a professional athlete, I'm not going to tell you that that's impossible, but it's probably, I mean, it's fighting an uphill battle because there are people who may have started with much easier foundations to build off of and are applying a similar amount of work and dedication. So you always have to compete with those people. But I don't know. That's got to be up to each individual person to judge where they think is worth dedicating their time. Maybe you could catch up with some really innovative strategy. Like, for example, Tim Ferriss, I think he got really into boxing or MMA. I'm trying to remember which it was.
Well, in 4-Hour Workweek, he talks about, I think he's in Korea in a certain martial arts competition, and he thinks about how can I hack this to win? And the easiest way was to exploit one of the rules where it said if somebody gets pushed out of the ring 4 times, then they lose. So he just took advantage of that and pushed him out several times. But I think he also has a lot of skill in other martial arts.
He certainly does, but it was jujitsu. I just looked it up. So he had not done jujitsu very long. He had practiced other martial arts, but he was certainly not a professional martial arts champion or anything like that. But he was able to think outside the box and find a way to exploit a particular rule to then beat people in competition who were way, quote unquote, better than him traditionally. Andy Warhol is maybe another example of an unconventional artist who exploited certain things that nobody had ever really exploited before. And some people get really angry at him about his art because he, did a lot of things that were based off of pop icons. And a lot of times he was just directing other people to actually produce the prints for him and things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It kind of relates to what you were talking about before, Katie, about how there's like 2 ways to be great at art. Either like the incremental, building your skill over a long period of time, which is like, I guess, the more craft focused way. And then there's the having an insight that compounds your skill and basically lets it get more bang for its buck, so to speak. And it seems like these Tim Ferriss and Andy Warhol are on one extreme of just having great insights and maybe not so much talent when it comes to pure craft, and most artists are somewhere in between.
Exactly. And I think that if you're behind, quote unquote, and you really want to get good at something, it's probably best to try to focus on insight. So focusing on getting insight is a weird thing. I don't think that you can just sit down and think really hard and say, I want to have an insight. But
you have to take risks to get insights. Like in a lot of cases, like if you're going to try doing psychedelics or something, you kind of have to risk psychosis, which is basically having a major systematic false insight. That's one way of looking at it anyway, in some cases. I'm sure there's different kinds of psychosis. But are we feeling we want to wrap up?
Yeah.
I'm feeling that way.
Okay. Thank you for watching, audience. This has been really interesting. If you want to see more of our content, please subscribe, check out our Patreon, and we'll see you next time.
Wait, can we try to tie it back to writing in the subject before we just end it?
Okay. Do you want to say something? Go ahead.
Okay. Something like, how should we do it? Okay, so you just mentioned psychosis. And if you want to take risks, sometimes you have to risk psychosis. Okay. Yeah, actually, I think that ties really well into what we've been talking about this whole time, especially since it seems like there's a lot of evidence that creativity is often linked to psychosis and certain types of mental illness. And I wouldn't advocate that anyone try to induce mental illness, but maybe walking that line is beneficial for creative pursuits and writing, and is a lot of what makes writers great. Is that close enough, or does anyone want to respond to that? Or
I mean, it's hard to say. Like, I feel like there's a lot more people who walk that line who just end up not producing much at all. But maybe that's necessary for there to be those few who produce the useful, beautiful art that we love.
Okay. I guess that's it.
yeah, I don't know if that's any better.
I probably won't include what I just said. I'll just probably end it up what Katie says.
Okay.
Anyway.
It depends on if we end it. I mean, it's also true, but I don't know how light or dark we want to end it.
I mean, we placed a lot of importance on like writing and on the creation of art, but like, how important is it really? Like, is it pursuing creative brilliance? Like, should it really come at the expense of everything else in life, or should it come at? Is it worth risking psychosis to pursue creative brilliance, or is it like, how important is it to be artistic? Why even try to be artistic?
Well, it's up to every individual to decide. And I think some people will have that desire to push the boundaries a little bit. And sometimes you have to take a little risk. But I don't think the risk of psychosis is all that high. I mean, especially if, say, you just decide to be an artist and try to improve or try to introduce a more creative side of yourself, it's probably not so likely that you're going to enter into mental illness because of that. But yeah, some people might choose a more standard path through life, and some people are willing to venture into the unknown.
Well, I think all of these are decent ending points.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us on the Multiversity Project. We hope you found this episode both mind-bending and enjoyable.
We can be found all over the social media space and at multiversitypodcast.com.
If you like this content, give us a like, comment, follow, share, or support us on Patreon.
Catch you on the flip side.